There. We'll let them all get there. Thank you for doing this.
Oh no, thank you for letting me do this. Thank you everyone for being here. I guess we don't have a ton of time, so I'll just jump right in. But I wanted to, before we get started, ask how many people had heard about the Bisbee deportation before today, or before you heard about Robert's documentary?
We had a couple of eager hands here. That was
Okay. Well, I'll be honest. I had never heard of it before and was actually pretty surprised that I hadn't heard of it before. It seemed like a pretty significant event in our country's history. So with that, I wanted the first question to you, for you to be, how did you learn about it? And from what you learned about it, what inspired you to make this documentary? And what did you not know before you made the documentary that you learned during the process?
Well, first of all, thank you, and thanks for staying. Thanks to the Hammer Museum, and thanks to producer Bennett Elliott, one of the many collaborators who helped make the film possible. So please, yeah. So I first heard about the deportation when I first went to Bisbee. So my mother-in-law bought a house, like a old mining cabin, to have like a family vacation spot before I was part of the family, really. And I don't know if that's me, but it's very loud and violent. And I fell in love with this place. Like, it's as strange and beautiful as you can see, hopefully, on the film. Hopefully you feel the same way. Who's been to Bisbee? Is there same people who heard about the deportation before? So it's a strange, really, really strange place. Like, and haunted. Like I don't believe in ghosts, as a rule. I'm a pretty agnostic person in terms of ghosts, but I definitely believe in ghosts in Bisbee. You just can't. And I think there's part of that is just that the energy from the mines is a real thing. Actually, there's real like copper minerals and other things that are still in the mines. It's like a little bit like being in a lightning storm when the lightning strikes and you feel something. Plus, you have everybody walking around telling you all the ghosts, and the landscape's the same. And so I fell in love with this place and immediately picked up Robert Houston's book, Bisbee 17. My then future mother-in-law is a historian, and she was like, "You got to read this book. You're gonna really respond." Because I was so into the place that she's like, "You're gonna love this," and I was like, "Gonna love this awful story about a deportation." Okay, so it is a fictional account of the whole thing, and this was 2003. This is about 5 or 6 years before I made my first feature. This is my sixth film. And my first idea was, hey, maybe we can recreate this with the locals by having them restage the deportation, which at the time I had no idea what that meant. I had no idea what that would be. Like, I didn't even like reenactment, and that's not a thing that I was interested in per se. But and so then the process, the learning process was, I'd spent 15 years thinking about the story, really, and it was the 100th anniversary that sort of allowed us to come back. And we started filming in October 2016, so a month before Trump was elected. Had been thinking about the story for all those years, then started when everyone thought there was no chance that the border situation was going to get worse. It's been bad for a long time, of course. And when we first started going there, the Minutemen and the freedom fighters in Tombstone were murdering people on the border, and it was, so it was bad then and it's bad now. So I guess what did we learn? I learned everything. We worked with a historian named Katie Benton-Cohen who's the reason, she is the reason why there is a list of names that only 10, 15 years ago did she, as a graduate student, compile this list of names that had been lost. And we went from first sources and worked with her directly, and then the town sort of took it from there.
Yeah. So just one more question before we get into the actual substance of the film. How did you decide to kind of tell the story the way you did? In the opening shot, I thought it was really interesting that that the gentleman was trying to get all the kids out of the shot, and that stayed in there, like him saying, "We need a clean shot for me to do this." But also just, part of it being a typical documentary where you're following people and kind of documenting their lives, but then also like intertwining the actual reenactment in there. I didn't even know that a reenactment was happening until a little later in the film. I thought people were like going on this like tour and it was like this kind of public attraction, and then I realized, oh, this is actually what's to come. So kind of how did you come, or what made you portray it in that way?
Well, this is something we've been sort of working towards with the previous films. I'm really interested in putting actors and acting in documentaries because it really fucks with people's heads. And like, you put an actor in a documentary and people are like, wait, is it real? Is it not? And we kind of like a few films ago, a film of mine that I didn't think of in that way was reviewed, and someone said that the main character gave one of the best performances of the year. And I realized, oh, that's what I'm really fascinated by actually, is like, because I was editing her like it was a performance, and I was editing her because she was performing, it was a film about a teenager, and she was performing being an adult. And then so I was like really fascinated with how she was faking being an adult, and how you could learn a lot about someone by what they're projecting and sort of, pretending to be, what they're performing. And so the subsequent films have sort of like investigated that further and further. And by the time we got to this, it was really like when you see people, acting in a certain way, what they're really doing is trying to process things, because especially they're not actors, so they're really worried about how they're going to be portrayed. They're really worried about whether they're going to get it right or wrong, and then they're bringing up things from themselves into the performance. And when you can actually see all that, and so we try to just sort of create like a way into seeing all that. So the backstage stuff mixes with the interview stuff, mixes with the making of the documentary stuff, and that's all to help you sort of see through the process of thinking through, because that's what the film's about, is processing history and processing our own role and what those roles mean to us today, and why this is not a 1917 story, it's a 2017 story. And for me, like those moments before people talk, like, I'm a little skeptical of like documentary portraiture. It's like a thing that's a little bit of a cliche in some documentaries. It can be beautiful and it can be cheesy, like everything. But I wanted to get the sense, in Bisbee, the whole relationship was they were there to tell us their story, and we were there to document their story. And I wanted to elevate that to put it like to them feeling like they're on a stage a little bit. And that was the original idea. Just, people are on a stage, they have this moment, but then something really weird would happen, and like you could see it briefly, and I bet with this beautiful projection you could really see it when you meet Sue Ray for the first time, and there's a speck of dust that comes across the frame. And I don't know, I felt like ghosts were literally filling those quiet moments. And maybe that was just Bisbee freaking me out or something. But and I don't think I was on drugs. But it was just the silences started to become a huge part of what we were experiencing.
Okay, now I'll ask questions about the actual content of the film. Something I found really interesting was hearing kind of people say a both sides kind of thing, like just about who was right and who was wrong, and maybe both sides could be right, and the miners deciding to strike and the company deciding to deport them. Why do you think there was even space for so many people to have so many different views? I especially thought it was interesting to hear this is a labor dispute. This is ethnic cleansing, this is patriotism, and all of these different views. Like, how can one community have all those views on the same exact thing?
Well, because it's a founding mythology of the town. I mean, what the film, it's a pretty well documented event for something that was sort of covered up for so long. But what the movie's really about is those differing sort of ideas, because people are using the deportation just like in the time, the mining companies were using the idea that these were radicals to justify an action that was an anti-labor action. They were creating a narrative. The IWW was creating a narrative. They were creating a narrative that we're going to stop the war and we're going to overturn capitalism, and that was unrealistic, certainly, but it was idealistic and became an international movement. So. The idea is that we're seeing people working through narratives and working through the power of narrative, and how you can see it when someone says, "I think this was an ethnic cleansing," and you can see that for that guy, that was an aha moment. He like looked at this story, which could truly be read in all kinds of ways, and said, "That's what I need to latch onto." And that probably says as much about him as it does the story, really. But the reason why it can be so complicated is because it's a company town. I mean, it's not like Amazon moving to Queens, right? Like Queens is a ecosystem that will either take or reject Amazon, right? Like. But Amazon's a huge company. Queens is an ecosystem. Those things are two powerful forces. There is no other reason to have a town in the Mule Mountains other than the copper mines, at first, at least. Yeah. And so the entire psychology of the town is built on the idea that the company is good. And the company is good because they have hospitals and schools and high schools and people would be like, you cannot say anything bad about Phelps Dodge. I literally grew up in a Phelps Dodge hospital. You're saying something bad about my mother. Yeah. It's that kind of thing. So that persists today. I mean, the land is still owned by the mining company Freeport-McMoran, which is the mining company there. So when you own land in Bisbee, you're effectively part of the company in a way. So those ties go deep, and they create this sort of tension that remains in town, I think.
And do you think, and I'll ask both sides of this question to be balanced, do you think because Phelps Dodge had they built schools, they just kind of created the town and were providing jobs, that made the people who were company people more susceptible to be manipulated by the message that they were putting out? And on the other side of that, with the IWW, were the miners just, because the war was going on and there was this great demand and they were actually, people needed their work to be done, do you think that they were also maybe open and susceptible to being kind of manipulated by a narrative that was being pushed there?
We're dealing with a situation where it's two sides were masters of propaganda. So the newspapers were owned by the mining companies, and then we get into that a little bit. And then on the other side, the IWW was not a violent group. They spoke a lot of violence. They said things like, "We're going to sabotage, we're going to blow up your building." Like they would go into, there's countless stories of them going into the local grocery store and say, "If you don't shut this down, we're going to blow it up." And they didn't have dynamite in the hills, but it made sense to believe that they might have dynamite in the hills because of their rhetoric, And what you're really seeing in some ways is a conflict of two masterful uses of propaganda in some ways, and that the IWW, for example, for the Mexican workers who were above ground and they weren't getting paid the equal wages, and they were never unionized before the IWW came to town. And part of what happened was basically the metal and mine workers union failed right before, and the IWW saw this as an opportunity. They went to Bisbee and Butte at the same time, Butte, Montana, and the idea that as they said it was going to be things of a scissors and try to cut the line off of the war. And so you have a bunch of workers in Bisbee who want better wages and working conditions, including Mexicans who were half the people deported that day. And then the IWW comes in and talks about, anarcho-syndicalism, and they're talking about stopping the war, which maybe it wasn't the message of the workers, right? So, and on the other side, the companies own the town and own the psyche. And remember that, the Great War was not a popular war until the propaganda machine started to turn it into a popular war. And Bisbee was called a white man's camp. It was considered an American camp, which meant it was good for white people to go there. And it was as patriotic as a place could be. So those tensions existed very much in both sides were susceptible. To answer your question, I think the most haunting question of the whole film is when how do you get 2,000 people to keep a secret? And there's no answer, because the answer is obvious in a way. It's because it's popular. It's because they voted for it. They supported it, and that's. You keep a secret when you, but it should be said also that a few years later they realized, the deportation had become a black mark and it was buried promptly because people realized how bad it was.
Mm-hmm. And so, given kind of the two sides or the multiple different views on whether or not this was okay, why it happened, if it should or should not have happened, we kind of talked about this backstage about how the reenactment came to be, but do you feel that that was the only way to kind of capture what everyone believed about the deportation in commemorating it for its 100th year anniversary?
Do you mean the reenactment was, or the?
Yeah, the reenactment.
Yeah. I mean, that was just the idea. The idea was like you could set up, you can do a more traditional version, and then what you end up getting is like sort of regurgitating information or something. But this sort of, I hope, at least I hope you guys. I mean, for us, it allowed a much more emotional sort of connection to it, and Fernando, thank you, one person it worked for, great. The Fernando had an amazing thing that he said recently when he was doing a Q&A. He said that, and it's going to sound cheesy coming from me, but just imagine being as cool as Fernando saying it. He was just said like, when he's saying I am the IWW, and you see him go from being an apolitical person, and not an uncomplicated journey, truly. Like, I hope you all felt cringy whenever I corrected him when he couldn't say the word solidarity. That's an intentionally cringy Anglo moment. It really shows how much of an outsider we are to his world in a lot of ways. But his very complicated journey to the moment where he says, we are the IWW, he said he felt like the ghosts were speaking through him. And like I said, cheesy from me, cool from Fernando. But I think what he meant was that knowledge and history and the presence that we were all there doing this led him to an understanding. And I don't think that that's uncomplicated. Like I said, I think the end of the film for me is about when you know your history and you can become radicalized, or you can become traumatized, and it can be both, and it can be at the same time. Like now that he knows his history in a different way, and he knows his own the connection between his personal history and the history of the town that he loves so much, he's going to be haunted by that as well as invigorated, hopefully, by that.
Yeah. Could you talk a little bit more about kind of the connection that some of the actors had with their personal lives and the roles that they played? I was really struck at the end when Mel Ray talked about, well, back then these were different values, and they probably thought it was fine, but maybe it's not so okay now.
Yeah, I mean, it was important for us to, most of the people chose their own roles, or that we worked with them to pick their own roles. So it was like, which is a crucial part, because the idea is these roles are not written by us to sort of hit some sort of narrative points. I mean, they do that, they do effectively do that in some ways, but they're really, they're meant to bring out what's inside of people, And so sometimes it was really fun for people to pick certain roles that they did identify with or they didn't identify with. And then, the Graham specifically, Dick Graham, who picked to play Walter Douglas, he was gleeful to play Walter Douglas because he greatly admires Walter Douglas, which it's very hard to find someone in the world who greatly admires Walter Douglas. And Dick Graham is one, and he's very proud of his portrayal, even though, I think he looks pretty bad in some ways, but he's like, I don't think I look bad, I'm telling you what I think, so... for us, that was, it's always all the different relationships. So Fernando's relationship to his character, and then the Ray's relationship, obviously, to the grandfather and his brother. Doug Graham, who is Dick's son, is a very stoic, cool guy who runs the mining tour, and he's like just... But I remember one of the things that we most wanted to do was the dream was, can we get this really cool guy who knows a lot about history but doesn't talk about his feelings very much to dress up and play essentially his great-great-grandfather dragging Fernando down the street. Like, that was like an image, because there was widespread reports of Mexicans being dragged down the streets. And I was just like, if I can get them both to understand what this image is and to collaborate on it, because to do something like that, you have to be together. You have to actually like know each other and connect on a deeper level to perform something like that. That was just a dream, So that's what it was all about. That stuff. I was like, how can we work with people? And that even seems more prescriptive than it was. Like, honestly, it was like, well, what do you want to do? Like, Fernando walking off the train, for example, was Fernando's choice. He wanted to leave the train, and I was like, do you want to get deported or do you want to do something different? He's like, fuck it, let's do something different. And that was how we did it. It was like, all right, guys, we're doing something different. So it was all just trying to, continually respond to what was actually happening knowing the people and working with how they were working through the reenactments.
Yeah. Um, so another kind of area I wanted to explore, and I think it's probably going to be obvious that we would talk about this, is how this parallels to the time that we're in now. I kind of mentioned this a little bit before, but just thinking about the manipulation and kind of stoking fears within people to get them to subscribe to whatever larger message someone's trying to push. Kind of seems like what Trump has done around immigration, convincing people. We can just look at the caravan issue and convincing people that they are in extreme danger and all of these bad things are going to happen just to get people to go along with whatever it is that he wants to do, closing our borders. Could you talk about, how you were thinking about that as you made the film, and even separate from your own thoughts, just objectively what you were observing while you were down there?
I mean, so having thought about this for many years, Trump certainly wasn't the start of it. And at first it was really a labor story more than anything. Arizona's a right to work state, and being able to sort of kindle the language of those labor songs was one of the original ideas. Like, how can you tell a labor story in 2017? It's very difficult to do that.
One quick question.
Yeah.
You just mentioned the songs. You can add this into your answer for now, but I was just wondering, where the decision came to make this a musical.
Well, actually, the decision really comes from labor movements. I mean,
Okay.
Cesar Chavez had, theatrical musicals in the fields.
So was that you or the actor?
It was all, it was us.
Okay.
We added that
Okay.
into the thing. But at the same time, God, Country, and the Copper Queen Mine was written by Britt Hansen, and he was going to do a really campy musical about the deportation. And then he kind of got too busy once Trump got elected because he's an attorney in town. And we were like, well, we can use that song. And so one of my favorite moments of the movie is when they're singing God, Country, and the Copper Queen Mine, and that's written by the local attorney. So it was all collaborative,
Okay.
even if we were forcing that.
tied
And
in.
the songs are all sung. The person who plays Fernando's voice is one of my former students, Sebastian Martinez, who's from Mizzou and amazing. To answer, wait, what was the question?
Sorry,
before?
we were talking about just the ties to
Oh, yeah.
immigration now. and-
Yeah, so we didn't, we started it thinking we were making a somewhat esoteric sort of how do you get, I mean, obviously, because the word deportation means something slightly different. Half the people were Mexican, half the people were Eastern European. It's not the word that we can't help but associate with now. And then Trump gets elected. By the second trip, we took 4 or 5 trips to Arizona before we moved there for 6 weeks to make the principal part of the film. And every trip, it got progressively clearer what was happening. And I think by the time we got to July 2017, every single person knew what we were doing, what the images were going to mean. That's why when you see them all hugging each other at the end, it was an incredibly emotional experience. That one white kid says, "This is the largest group therapy session." It's important that that's followed by a Mexican man who says, "You guys were good, maybe too good," which is the too good is a haunting, pair of words, in that circumstance. So, I mean, for us, and it sort of extended into the editing. Obviously, things got worse and worse and worse, and you point out the quote unquote caravan issue. I mean, it is the same playbook. It is the same playbook. There's the other. They are scary. We have to take away your rights and take away the rights of the country and take away the rights of immigrants in order to make you safe. It is the exact same playbook as the deportation. There's almost no difference really between it. It's even corporate interests are at the heart of it all, And but for us, we were editing when I figured that scene in the middle of the deportation where we cut to Mel's bodega, and he's from Lebanon, and he's a beautiful man. We love Mel. He's our favorite person in all of Bisbee because he ran the corner store and gave us batteries. But not just that, he's also lovely. But he had his first experience in America was coming to Bisbee. He landed in Tucson, traveled in the middle of the night to Bisbee, and then woke up the next morning and was like, "This is America? Okay, I love this." Like crazy, right? And he got emotional in his scene, whatever. So when I figured out where that was going to be edited, and then I literally shut down the computer, and it was the day that 100 7-Elevens had been raided, and people were being pulled out. And it was like, it was the same images. The images that we had created were literally, they could have been intercut. I mean, it's always a documentarian's dilemma. Like you make a film and you're almost afraid of it becoming more relevant. Like I wish we were talking about how weird and esoteric the story was.
Yeah. And do you get the sense that then and even now there's this kind of looming message of and I think both Democrats and Republicans do this, but like measuring immigrants based on the value they either add to the country or the value that people believe they like take away from the country.
Yeah, I mean, in this case, it's a black and white version of that
Yeah.
because they are literally laborers.
Right.
Bisbee at one point had 27,000 people there, most of them immigrants, most of them there for opportunities. And everything, if it's a company town, the immigrants are all there to work in the mines. They're from all over the world to work in the mines. The relationship between human and work is absolute at that point, and they're essentially slaves to this work. So, and also they're getting better paid. I mean, the truth is also Bisbee was one of the highest paid camps in the country. So like it was complicated, right? Like they were there and they were getting paid pretty well. So when the IWW comes in and says we're going to shut down the mines, some people are like, but we're getting paid so well. Why would you do that? And forget the Mexicans that don't get paid as much. Like we're getting paid better, like that kind of thing. So people were actively divided into ethnic groups. They were actively divided into types of workers, and that was used against them on a day like that.
Okay, so I had two more questions. I'll wrap them in one really quickly, and then we can open the floor up for questions. The first is, if you have any advice for people in the audience today on how best practices to kind of reckon with our own history. It might not be Bisbee, but something else that's happened in our history, in our respective lives, or something that's going on now as we tie those things to the past. And then the final question, do we know what happened to the people who were deported?
Yeah, so we know a little bit. So John C. Greenway, who's played brilliantly, I think, by Scary James West, his big idea was, hey, we're going to take them to these traitors. They're traitors to this country. We're going to take them to the Army base, which was in Columbus, New Mexico, like a 17-hour train ride. They get to the Army base, and the Army's like, we're not taking these people. This was before kidnapping laws existed. We had to wait for a sweet young Charles Lindbergh baby to be before there was even such thing as kidnapping. But so basically they were like, you can't do this, and we're not taking them. So they backed the train up 45 minutes or so, and pushed them out into the desert, into the middle of the ridiculously harsh desert near a town called Hermanas, but the town was far away, and they set up a camp. And immediately, I mean, this was pretty well documented. People were starting to take names and stuff. No Mexicans were ever interviewed, so we don't have any clue what happened to half the deportees. But among the people who were interviewed and who did get their names, we've been able to trace back. And you see some of this work done by Mike Anderson and others in the film. But most of them were drafted. So the brutal irony was that they were deported for being anti-American, radicals, and they went to die in the war, But there's also some really inspiring, crazy stories. Like one became a Los Angeles, an LAPD officer who saved a baby and was on the cover of the Los Angeles Times as a hero, and it had his entire story. Like, he was born here, he did this. It doesn't say he was deported for being a radical wobbly, And even crazier was this one guy who ended up in Santa Ana racetrack, which is, of course, where the Japanese internment camps are happening. So he had been part of these two sort of awful events in our history, just randomly. So in terms of best practice, the only advice I really have is like, I think we're a country that has a very strange relationship to our history. Obviously, we don't like to think about it, but I think, as a culture, we're starting to reconcile with it. You're from Chapel Hill, like they just tore down, some statues, Silent Sam, And I remember, I went to NC State, very nearby. Those statues are a part of how we identify as Southerners, as people. And I think we're confronting things, and I think in a new way. And I think some of the reaction to this film that's been positive has been, seeing people try to make art out of confronting the past is a nice thing to see. And we didn't even, we just sort of went for it, and it sort of came organically together. How collaborative it ended up being. And I don't know. I think just make art. Sometimes we don't think art and politics mix too well, but they can, especially when they're community based and you can bring people together.
Okay, well, let's give Robert a round of applause, and then we'll. And so, if you just raise your hand, the ushers will come around with microphones for you to ask your questions.
Thanks for staying.
I was just really fascinated by your formal approach to capturing the reenactments. There's that shot of Fernando kind of at dusk with the lights simmering behind him, and then also the scene before the loyalists sing. There's the use of the diopter lens. Were these things that you structured out or created shot lists for? Were you kind of shooting them off the cuff, or were you just incredibly lucky? I'm really fascinated by how you kind of went about capturing those moments.
Yeah, definitely lucky for one. But I think, our design was, we're going to make a film that has these sort of, these moments built on, first person accounts and built on historical record. But then also, we're going to make a musical, we're going to make a Western, we're going to use genre to sort of get into the psychology of storytelling and the psychology of the West and how we tell stories about the West, right? So we were looking for those kind of moments, and things like the split diopter. That's for people who are not nerds like the two of us. Those are that's when you can see two people, the foreground and the background is both in focus, and it's like this weird tricky lens, and it's really hard and fun to do. And Brian De Palma used it in all of his movies, and it's really a fun shot to get. And that's just that was just to play up the musical aspect, to play up the sort of grandiose, weird quality of that space. And we had a lot of fun with that. And that was an idea certainly that we were really excited about doing. But it really was, I really want you just to be thinking about the way images get processed. So not only are you watching the town come together to do this, but you're also thinking about how we have mythologized aspects of the West, how we continue to mythologize those aspects. And then furthermore, the characters are all in their own kind of movie a little bit. Like Fernando's in the musical, and James West is in his own, spaghetti Western or whatever he's in, and it's kind of interesting to see different, because they're amateur actors or non-actors, and how are they working through these things? So the formal stuff is really to bring that stuff to bear a little bit. And in terms of structure, we really thought hey, we're going to script some scenes, lay those out, and then, but we don't really know what's going to happen. So the team, like Bennett and everybody, it was difficult to for them to do their job, which is how do you build a fiction film, when I refused to do anything until we knew who would be in these scenes, and all the personal stories had to animate all those moments. So it was just, it's the reverse of how you would do a fiction film. We couldn't really even script things or really set things up until I knew how the stories were going to grow from the people, and so that just made everything tricky and difficult. And so there was sometimes we were overlapping all kinds of different things, and I just like the in-between spaces of things. I like when people are sort of acting but not. I love that, that in-between moment where you can kind of sense the anticipation of something and sense the thinking, like I was saying before. So, but mostly lucky.
Please hold for the mic. Please hold for the mic.
I think we're waiting for a microphone. Okay.
Thank you very much for a most fascinating documentary.
Thank you.
Two quick questions. One is the families. The men got deported. Did the families go with them, or did they stay in Bisbee, or did they eventually move? And the second one is most presentations where people try to what are you calling it? Reconstruction of the events are done. They try to be very, very authentic, and you didn't care about having the cars in the scene or having other aspects of the modern life. Was that intentional, where the people, you didn't try to do an authentic presentation of the
recreation.
time?
Yeah, no.
Recreation, thank you.
Yeah, no, it's certainly, yes, definitely intentional. I mean, I didn't even think of them as recreations in a strict sense. They're more like street performance pieces or something. I mean, we were actively trying to make the film happen in the present. And the important thing to also, I mean, the thing about those cars passing, those are all people witnessing the people dressed up and playing these parts as well. So we're also in a way like spreading the word of what happened by doing it in front of people. So that was actively trying to collapse the past and the present into one feeling and one sort of moment, you know, which is kind of what and that may seem like an esoteric idea in some ways, but that's what it literally feels like to be in Bisbee every day. So we're just dramatizing what it already feels like to be there in a way. And in terms of the families, so only about 35 or 36 men ever came back to Bisbee. So the families, many families were broken up. Now it should be said that that some families were brokenhearted and were saying, please don't take my husband. Other women were saying, you better get your ass on that train and not break the strike because we're not scabs, you know. So sometimes it was a willful thing, and sometimes it was a forced thing. But yeah, many families were broken up, and that was a huge part of the legacy of the deportation, was that families were left to contend with that for generations. And you still see some of the scars of that on the Ray family. I think they talk about it a little bit, and you can sense it in their faces that brother deporting brother was a major traumatic event that ripped their family apart, and it was hard to heal them. But it's also funny, because funny is not the word. It was also, the company then over the next 10, 15 years would secretly pay for families, people who were deported, here's $1,000 to go start a business. Don't tell anybody. And there's no actual documentation of this, but there's a lot of between people talking, accounts of people being paid on the sly so they don't sue anymore, because there was a lot of lawsuits. Most of them were thrown out. Harry Wheeler was actually tried and found innocent after a 30-minute trial, and then he was kicked out of town. They were like, "You're innocent. Don't come back." And he ran for re-election and lost 80% to 20, and died lonely and sad. And it was so they had realized very quickly how bad it was, and had to sort of reconcile with the fact that they had basically orphaned 1,200 or so families.
Okay, well, thanks for the film. That was rich and complex. So, I'm wondering, first, were you aware of, I guess, the parallels between individual psychology and group psychology? Was that kind of theme that you were developing? The idea of kind of repression and then reenactment and so on at a kind of community scale. And also the idea of violence. I think there was a striking quote at some point. It was voiceover about how violence is needed to kind of tame the desert or subdue the desert, and the connection with guns and Second Amendment rights and so on. It just seems like maybe people who are prone or at the ready to be violent are maybe more likely to see the possibility of violence and expect it and react accordingly. So I'm just wonder if you could say a bit more about that as well.
Yeah, sure. I appreciate that. I think that's accurate, and but I also think that the language violence is necessary to tame the West. I mean, that's literally manifest destiny. That is American psychology, turned into quasi beat poetry or whatever the hell Christie's is doing there. To me, it's also that these stories continue to be relevant. The Tombstone story. I love Tombstone, but it is a very, very strange place. Who's been to Tombstone? It is a strange place. It is it is as radical right wing of a place as you can imagine. It's also really fun because they're all dressed up and it's cool. But they Tombstone would have been a ghost town had they not come up with this clever idea to reenact a phony history 5 times daily, right? And that phony history directly relates to this sort of idea of a good guy with a gun. So it's a psychology that gets played through with reenactment. So to get to your first question, yeah, of course. I mean, that's why it's the sort of the way that playing dress up and gathering in the space where something happened brings up sort of these latent desires and these buried sort of ideas about what it means to be a man and what it means to be white and what it means to be an immigrant and what it means to be all these things, and seeing people sort of work through that stuff that's the content of the movie, I think. And I mean, and it's intense. Like, this is Arizona, so people were showing up to this recreation, with their own guns, and we had cops there, like, checking rifles to make sure that people weren't loaded, I mean, and they were like, you don't have to worry about me, Bob, like that kind of thing. And they were wearing their own costumes, a lot of them. I mean, we didn't have money to dress everyone, so people dressed themselves, and they were coming in full regalia, some people, and that's because, like, there is a deep sense of what that identity means, and there's a deep interest in playing that up. And we see this in Civil War reenactments. We see it in all kinds of dress up things in this country. Like, this country's full of dress up. The funny thing is that Bisbee doesn't like to do reenactment because they don't want to be Tombstone. So to get them to do this felt like we were pulling them through into something else. Like, we were getting them to, like, think about it maybe in a new way, like maybe be a little bit more Tombstone than they were comfortable with, but maybe something came out of that.
We can take one last question. I will let the ushers decide.
Thank you so much.
Hi. I was wondering if you could talk more about the moment when Fernando meets the cop.
James
actor.
West. Yeah.
Yeah. And the choice to do that, and also that moment when he kind of reacts to what the cop said.
Yeah.
Was that the real timing of his response to what Fernando
No, it's pretty
said?
brutally edited. Yeah. Like, I mean, but so that's, I've edited maybe 20 films or 25, I don't even know, a lot of movies. And that's probably the most brutal edit I've ever done in my life. But I promise you, if you saw the raw footage, you would understand how kind I was being to James. I mean, it was the cringiest conversation I've ever experienced, like, with cameras rolling. Like, I've experienced plenty of cringy conversations, but this is where, like, I had to take him aside afterwards because I'm really honest with people we're working with. I'm like, dude, you just white-splained America to Fernando. He's like, yeah, but that's pretty good for the movie, right? It's like, yeah, it's good for the movie, but you're an asshole. Like, what is your problem? And he's like, oh yeah, all right, and so that edit, I just was like, it's too good, and it's like, and it really does embody what was actually happening in the conversation, where Fernando was just like, listening. No, and mostly it just connects you to Fernando in a deep way, because at that point you're just like, there's a lot there, and he's not just like some cute boy who doesn't care about politics. Like, he knows what he's talking about, and he's fierce, and so it was worth the nasty edit, but I mean, it's also a good comedy moment too. You need jokes occasionally. So, but I promise, if you were to see the raw footage, you would feel that we were being nice, which is maybe not nice, because editing is almost never nice, actually. It can be brutal, but that one's a tough edit. But I stand by it.
Well, thank you again for everyone who came out, who stayed, and participated in the conversation with us. Just give Robert one more round of applause.
Thank you, Shaniqua. Thank you to the museum, and thanks for staying. Thanks.
Your land, this land is my land.